Here now? Okay, I'm an economist in the same way as David Cameron, in the sense that I studied philosophy, politics and economics at Oxford University. I graduated in 1980. My main work as an economist, it's a bit grandiose. I worked for the New Economics Foundation as their East European project worker, and then subsequently for the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development as their East European desk officer during the 1980s. So I spent a lot of time in Bosnia during the war. I've worked in Poland mainly and the Baltic States. And I wrote a book which was published in 1998, Market Failure, Eastern Europe's Economic Miracle, with my colleague Laszlo Andor, who at that stage was at the Budapest University of Economic Sciences and is now the Hungarian delegate on the board of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is actually just down the road here in Len Hall Street in the city. So those, if you like, are my qualifications to speak about economy. Those, if you like, are my qualifications to speak about economics. You will all be aware that the financial crisis is now reaching a head. It was always going to be the way after the state was dragged into rescuing the private banking system in 2008. There was always going to be a point where the state would run out of resources to prop up the nonsense that the private financial markets have become. We've all been lulled into a rather false sense of security over the last 4 years, because the world, the sky hasn't fallen on our heads, the banks haven't collapsed. That's basically because they've been taking all of the money that they've been given by the various governments and spending it on what they usually spend it on, which is creating more bubbles. When the banks collapsed in 2008, if you remember, Gordon Brown was speaking just down the road here at the Mansion House, and he congratulated the City of London on all the wonderful things they were doing and what a great success they were. A week later, the banks collapsed. And unfortunately, I'm a member of the Labour Party, but unfortunately, the leaders of the Labour Party, like Brown and Blair, and we're going to hear something about New Labour from Robin here later, were basically completely Manchurian candidates in a sense. They bought into the financial liberalisation agenda, which was really brought forward just as I graduated in 1980. Of course, the root of all the problems that we've got now goes back to then and to the Big Bang in the City of London in 1987. It was always going to end in tears. People like myself and other academic economists, particularly in the US, and I'm thinking of people like Dennis, it's based upon the idea that if the maths is clever enough and the computer is big enough, you can second guess the future. Now, all of you in this room will realise, even if you haven't got a mathematics background, that that's basically wrong. The Black-Scholes theory was developed by Myron Scholes and a few others, which was the basis of long-term capital management. They basically got the Nobel Prize for Economics, which is given by the Swedish Central Bank, which is basically controlled by right-wing economists, even though it's Sweden, and they've used the Nobel name without actually clearing it with the Nobel Committee, but they've been giving Nobel Prizes to basically people who are glorified maths teachers, frankly. They're not economists in my view. They don't look at reality and then decide what's happening. They've already got a theory before they start. And because they won the Nobel Prize for Economics, the Black-Scholes people set up long-term capital management. Loads of people gave them loads of money, and then they went bust in 1998. And just that one hedge fund, long-term capital management going bust, threatened the whole financial system. That was in 1998. And threats to the whole financial system have actually been there since the Mexican default of 1982. That's when the IMF stepped in to bail out Mexico, in other words, to pay off the Wall Street banks and keep the Mexicans in the game. Now, if you're a real free marketeer, you basically allow things to go bust. But since 1982, what's been happening is things have been not allowed to go bust. They've been bailed out by governments, and so the taxpayer has been on the hook all the way since then. And because the taxpayer has been on the hook all the way since then, they've been able to sustain this bubble behaviour for a generation, basically. There's been a whole generation of malpricing. The prices are all wrong, the system is actually a system of moral hazard where the more people lend and the more bust they become, the more money they can suck out of the taxpayer. And there is a legitimate argument made by Austrian school economists that basically all of this should just have been allowed to go bust. And I'm a left-wing economist, but I've got some sympathy with that view, because at least it's consistent. What we've actually got is neither fish nor fowl, which is that the free market is allowed to operate as long as they're making money, and as soon as they start to lose money, they go, they've got their hat out to the governments. Now, the problem is that governments, no matter how in the pockets of the financial elite they are, simply haven't got the resources to cover the bad debts that have been made. Estimates of the size of the shadow banking market are that it's at least 10 times bigger than the world economy, and probably a lot more. So you could carry chucking money down that black hole forever, and you would still never deal with the debt. The only way to deal with debt, ultimately, is to cancel it. That is one of the, this is actually in the capitalist playbook. When you lend somebody money, you're entitled to interest because of the risk that you may lose all of your money. Now, the capitalist class could have chosen to pursue a much more moderate policy than the one it has chosen to pursue. They could have continued with the kind of consensus approach to the economy which prevailed from 1945 to 1973, with some modifications, and they could have carried on redistributing, because redistribution is actually essential to a functioning capitalist economy. The top rate of tax in the 1950s in this country was 96%, and in the United States of America was 91%, and we had conservative governments in power in both of those countries. And of course the reason was that we were fighting the Korean War, and people understood very well that some people pay their taxes and other people get their head blown off. You provide the money, we provide the carry forward. That used to be the social contract. That social contract has been completely undermined in the last generation by people who think that they don't have to pay taxes at all because they're such a benefit to society just as they are.
So I've given you what you might call a potted history of the background to the crisis. We've now reached the end of the line. What's happening with Greece is quite clear that the bailouts for Greece have been predicated upon them carrying out an austerity policy. That is to say, cutting public expenditure. But in fact, rather than reducing their public debt, it's actually increased their public debt, which is exactly what a Keynesian economist would have predicted. And all of the governments of the world now are in the position that Herbert Hoover was in 1929, of saying if we just stand back, this will sort itself out. We've got to throw money at the banks, but basically capitalism works. It will work if we just cross our fingers. This is wrong. The markets can see that this is wrong, and they see the markets are schizophrenic. They want austerity, and then they realise that austerity means they're not going to be paid back. So they're running from one side of a burning debt to the other, wondering what the hell to do, and that's why we've reached the end of the line. There will be a crash in the global economy, in my view, either before Christmas or early in the new year. We've finally reached the point where governments can't stick elastoplast over it anymore. Now the consequences of that are pretty dire. We can perhaps go into them in questioning. Let's put this in the context of why we're all here, 9/11 and state crimes against democracy. The final serious bubble that was based upon some serious investment was the dot-com bubble, which burst in 2000. And at that stage, we should have had a global recession. But as luck would have it, 9/11 came along, and suddenly a Republican administration in the US, which had been elected to cut back on public expenditure, to get everything in line, small states, suddenly said, but this is a new circumstance. We are now at war with the Islamic world, and we've got to actually spend our way out. So at that point, they switched on the money printing machine, and they used 9/11 as the trigger for that, because they couldn't really justify doing that. What they should have happened at that stage in a capitalist economy is you have a crash. And of course, they call crashes recessions. You know, it's like a little dip, and then you come back again. In actual fact, there is no guarantee whatsoever that capitalism can't collapse into its own footprint, just like the Twin Towers. And that, I'm afraid, is what's about to happen. It will be a catastrophic event which will make 9/11 look like a minor event. And we're probably, as a result of this, going to war, and we're going to have a generalised war, certainly across all of the arc of instability from Somalia into Yemen, into Iraq, and then on into the Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. That whole area will definitely be a war zone. But of course, there's no reason why this can't be a war zone. And it was a war zone, if people remember, during the IRA bombing campaign, which was far more vicious, far more organised, and much more of a threat to the British state than anything we've seen from the so-called Islamists. And of course, many of us in this room suspect that the so-called Islamists are in fact being orchestrated by our intelligence services. That's the kind of thing that goes on. Now that's how serious the situation is. The financial crisis intersects with the military crisis, and we're now at a decisive turning point. So in effect, this meeting happening here today is happening at the cusp of very important events. And that's why it's so important to see you all here, and thank you all here for coming. Now I could go on, but I think I've given you a fairly clear pattern of what's going on here. The financial crisis is directly linked to the creation of a war psychology. And the people behind all of this, we could discuss who they are. I'm sure Robin and Tony will have views about who the elite are, which have orchestrated all of this. And of course, there's linkages between the financial oligarchy, top-level military, particularly the United States Air Force, intelligence services, and organised crime. They're a key feature of all of this. They're not because of the international drugs trade, they are major players. For example, they are keeping the banks afloat, as well as the governments. In 2008, the United Nations Office on Crime and Drugs issued a report saying, well, what's happened here is all the dirty money that's been under the mattress for years has just been sucked into the banking system in one go. It was a fantastic opportunity for money washing, because of course all of the criminals turned up, and the top-level bankers are running around going, we've got no money, we've got no money. He said, well, we've got some, would you like it? And they went, yes, 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 yes. So in other words, we've now got a situation where organised crime and its financial, and the drugs industry is big as the car industry, possibly bigger. We've got financial elites who are actually basically scammers, not SCADs, scammers. I mean, a lot of what's been going on in Wall Street and the City of London was the brothel where they did the special stuff, because they didn't actually have, the rules in the US were still too tight. So the Big Bang in the City of London said, no, if you want to do that naughty stuff, you can come and do it here. And the American banks took over pretty quickly during that period. And they did all of the worst stuff was actually done down the road in the City of London. And the third level, of course, is the planning of wars. We know that Operation Northwards was in 1964, where the top brass of the US military signed off on killing hundreds of their own people to start a war with Cuba. So they've been planning this kind of thing for years. Okay, I think I've given you a brief tour de horizon there of the connections between finance, military, and other matters. So I think I've said my piece.
Thanks very much, Martin.